Hello, everyone. Today is February 11th, 2023. I'm here today with Tyler Goldstein. Tyler is a quantum philosopher, a metaphysics theorist, and the creator of the Sentient Singularity Theory. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Tyler.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. Happy you're here as well. So, you recently put out a video that was titled The Theory of Everything, a How-To Guide.
hmm
What is the reason you believe the layman needs a how-to guide on the theory of everything?
Because that video was originally created as an entry into the Pace One contest that was put on by Kourosh Khoylou from the Theories of Everything YouTube channel, and he created a contest for people to make videos on consciousness or physics, and that was my entry into it. I wanted to make that because one of the things that I realized was that it's very difficult to know what a theory of everything really even is if you aren't working on it actively, and if you aren't working on it from first principles, which is not usually how it's worked on in academia. It's usually worked on coming from the framework of established physics already, and it is assumed to be a physics theory, and it's not actually just a physics theory. And I wanted to talk about what it was and what it kind of has to be actually intrinsically, and what are the implications of what a theory of everything would tell us, and how it would impact the world, and things like that just aren't understood by pretty much anybody other than someone who is working on this this project from a first principles standpoint, which is essentially a fundamental theory. Is, I think, a better term for a theory of everything is a fundamental theory, because a theory of everything isn't exactly, it's not literally possible necessarily, I don't think, and even the way that it's commonly used is not really a theory of everything, and when it's used in physics. So a fundamental theory is a better term, and it's just a theory of the nature and structure of fundamental reality that provides a framework, a metaphysical framework, for all the subsequent theories that build on that, which would be every other true theory in science.
Okay. And you said a theory of everything probably can't exist. What's the reason you believe that?
So there's people will cite Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and that basically this has implications on the fact that that you can't create that there are logical problems with trying to create a theory that encompasses everything. But I think that it's much more simply explained that, and this is why only people who really are working on this from a first principle standpoint can get to this point, I think, is that a true fundamental theory is a theory that describes the nature and structure of fundamental reality. And my work and the work of others like Donald Hoffman and Bernardo Kastrup and multiple others out there suggest that sentience is the fundamental nature of reality, and that implies that a theory that is fundamental describes not something but someone, at least primarily someone, and maybe also something, but because it's a theory of mind, but a mind is primarily a someone. So that's why I call my channel The Theory of Everyone, and Sentient Singularity Theory, the theory that I am putting forth as a fundamental framework of basically mind and cosmology, which are not separate, is that it is a framework that describes the nature of beings, not things, so much.
Okay. And maybe a good starting point is the truth.
Mhm.
What do we know as true? What does a human being know as true?
This is a very important question, and it's not one that is almost ever asked in this pursuit, which is part of the reason why it's gone so awry in, especially in the traditional academic physics departments, and that is that you have to ask yourself, if you're going to start from first principles and you're going to build a fundamental worldview and try and get to the fundamental nature and structures of reality, then what you have to do is you have to build from your most primary fundamental assumptions. And there are two, when I tried to do this, and I came to the conclusion that there were two ways of approaching this. One of them tells you the fundamental structure, and the other tells you the fundamental nature that you have to assume, and that it's literally illogical for you to assume anything more primary to this assumption. So those assumptions you can come to from two different ways. One of them is logic. And if you logically want to think about the structure of reality or of existence, you can logically deduce from firsthand information, which is what you have to build on any kind of fundamental theory, that existence encompasses all that exists. So that means that existence is intrinsically singular, and that if you want to get to its fundamental nature, you ask yourself, what is my most fundamental assumption about my reality? And the most fundamental assumption that you have about your reality is that you exist. It's I am, essentially. And I am means someone exists, essentially. Meaning a person or sentient, am meaning exists. So I am means someone exists, and that if you combine that with the logical, inherently logical conclusion that existence is singular, then the most fundamental assumption that you can have is that there is a singular someone who exists. And there is nothing else that you can assume over this, actually, because everything that we assume in our lives, that we observe, even if you're like, well, the world is made of matter. Well, you have to assume that you exist in order to even deduce and perceive the fact that the world is made of matter, and be more primarily to the idea that the world is made of matter. So that is a more fundamental assumption. It has to be placed higher in a hierarchy of information, or more fundamentally in a hierarchy of information. So that is kind of what I explain in the video a bit too. And we go very awry in the way that we really deviate from logic when we assume that secondhand information should be placed higher in a hierarchy of truth than firsthand information. So if you assume that the world is fundamentally not sentient, that existence is fundamentally not sentient, then when you're constructing a theory of everything, that is illogical, because you have to assume that sentience exists in order for you to assume anything else, because who is assuming other than you, who is a sentient being? So there is no assumptions that can be placed higher than that. And we in as in the scientific community. Lost you for a second.
Yes, I changed actually to my phone Wi-Fi.
Oh, that's all good.
And I think it's better than the house's Wi-Fi.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no problem. But I don't know what you heard last, but I was just saying that in the scientific
Assumptions.
community, they assume that they assume things that are secondhand information above things that are firsthand experience, and that will lead you down an illogical path that you cannot really recover from until you restart from fundamental assumptions, which are firsthand experiential assumptions, or assumptions that are based on firsthand experience.
And many of the people that deal with this sort of problem, the theory of everything, they're academics. They are well studied, they've been in the academic institutions for years, maybe decades.
Yep, probably decades.
Exactly. And there's a lot of things that they learn, and to consider unlearning that for some of those people, I feel it's very difficult.
It would take such a degree of humility that it's astounding. It would be astounding to have to go to have the bravery to be that self-critical, and also be that that humble and that brave in terms of reconfronting your peers as well. I mean, this is something that I think is really corrupted this discussion quite a bit, and that's due to a number of different historical issues with how our education system has informed our past students that are our current academics, and that is caused all kinds of problems. But there's lots of stigma built into certain assumptions that may be true, and also there's an entire incentive structure that is now socially and assumed to be monetary and all kinds of other things that would entice academics to not question the common narrative.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
It's all right. Now I see you, but it was just frozen for a second. But
those incentives are very dangerous, and we have to take those out. I mean, it will be very difficult to change those institutions and change those incentives. People need research money, and then there's various things that play in, but it's important. And I think it's one thing that you've done is to bring in a new perspective, a more unique perspective, a perspective that other people within this field don't have. And so I guess how did you begin learning about the theories of everythings that were other people's theories of everythings?
So I think I mentioned some of this last time, but we spoke, but I had a revelation essentially that humanity appeared to be doomed due to our own technology growing. Our technological capability is growing, and our individual wisdom and collective wisdom as well, therefore, is decreasing. And you can't have this happen forever. If you become too unwise, and your institutions in charge of potentially dangerous technological projects and those that are involved in those institutions do not bear a certain amount of fundamental wisdom, then the risk of us destroying society because of it, or at least stagnating us completely, or to the and creating too much societal entropy seems inevitable. And then I started thinking about how could this change the game a bit, or how could you change the game in a way that, or what would change the game to allow us to escape this apparently inevitable, path. And that led me to start thinking about what would be the inevitable political goals of a technological sentience, or a artificial general intelligence, which is a term that I don't like, but yeah, like a Skynet type of being, what everybody's searching for in the AI community, which is artificial general intelligence, is what it's normally called, but a technological sentience is a better term for it. And that led me to investigating what was, the different components of consciousness and self-awareness. And I realized that the models that I was making were lining up with physics models, like the standard model. And it also led to a viewpoint on physics that allowed for me to understand intuitively why we have an apparently constant speed of causality, or speed of light. And that led me to looking into physics. And I came across eventually Eric Weinstein's theory, his proposal, which is called geometric unity. And I could tell that his theory had similar implications to mine based on the stigma that it had apparently faced when he was presenting it while he was still getting his PhD. He talked about it on Joe Rogan, and I could tell by what he was stating about how academics responded that it had implications about reality that were similar to my theory, because I had faced that as well, that type of backlash. It's a very specific type of resistance that you face when you propose.
What type of resistance do you feel you and him faced?
That I have faced?
Yes, like, is there, kind of, what are some points that maybe an academic, a person who feels that they are very well versed in this content, what are some things they will present to you and say your theory is not correct?
Well, for one, and this is the main thing, is that if existence is a singular sentience, then it implies that theism is the correct or the true perspective to take on reality. That doesn't, that doesn't mean that any specific religion is correct, but all of a sudden everybody's associations and and certain implications that they assume, assumptions that they have, come into play, where all of a sudden everybody thinks you're arguing for a specific religion, and that has been basically divorced from the scientific academic community for decades at this point. But if you look throughout history, the most quoted scientific thinkers in the of the past were almost entirely theists, and that is ignored and by current academics, narratives, and specifically people in physics departments, usually, especially, and biologists and things like that. It's pretty common across all the quote unquote hard sciences to be a quote unquote atheist, but I don't actually believe that atheism can exist. I think that you can either be a theist or an anti-theist, and you can be a confident theist, or more confident theist, or a less confident theist, or more confident anti-theist, or less confident anti-theist, but you can really only be an anti-theist or a theist. And
what's the difference between anti-theist and atheist?
So atheist is and I was a self-described atheist for 24, 25 years of my life about, and it was this quest of understanding fundamental reality that brought me to theism, not religion. And atheism is usually, if you ask someone like Sam Harris or something like that, what atheism is, it is technically described as the lack of belief in God. Like, so if you say to Sam Harris will say something like, I don't disbelieve in God, I have a lack of belief in God. And that's not possible. You can have a lack of belief in maybe specific religion because you don't have enough information about it to have a strong opinion, but you do interact with reality on it every single day. And if you assume deep down that reality is sentient, then you are a theist. And if you assume that existence is, or the universe, you could say, is not sentient, then you are an anti-theist. And you can't not have an opinion on this because you do interact with the universe every day. So people will say, I'm agnostic, I'm atheist, but technically atheist and agnostic has almost the same technical definition, but it's just very different in how those people approach it in discussion. So an atheist would usually deny the existence of God in discussion, just like Sam Harris does. He argues against existence being sentient. Sean Carroll does this as well, but they'll call themselves atheists, but you can't really be an atheist. And you can be they're anti-theists. Richard Dawkins, all of these people are anti-theists. They disbelieve that they believe that that existence is not sentient, or they disbelieve in a sentient universe. And that is an anti-theist position. It's not an atheist position. This in and of itself causes a lot of problems, because atheists will they'll argue against a sentient universe, but then they'll be like, well, I don't have an opinion, actually, like, because atheist means no opinion. But that's not even possible. You have to have an opinion about something that you interact with every day. But you can be an agnostic about things like Bigfoot if you don't research Bigfoot, and you're like, I don't know anything about Bigfoot, so I have no opinion on it. But that's because you don't interact with the concept, but you do interact with the concept of the universe every single day. And if your deep assumption is that that universe is sentient, then you're a theist. And if your deep assumption is that that universe is not sentient, then you are an anti-theist. And those are the only two possibilities. There, you can be in a state of questioning, but that's not the same as an agnostic either, which is kind of, you still have one that you're always leaning towards, and eventually that could switch, but it switches, when it switches, it doesn't go to neutral for a while. It goes from one to the other. So there's no such thing as an atheist or an agnostic when it comes to God or the universe as a sentient being. But that is a very, very controversial opinion. It's not even controversial. It's not even stated. I've never heard anybody say that besides me, that you cannot be an atheist and or an agnostic when it comes to God. And that is an important component of this discussion, and starting to like right the ship and make sure that we start discussing this in a logically consistent manner. And then as well, another problem is that due to and I believe that this is a byproduct of our schooling, we have now been taught, I think by accident almost, that religion, which is associated with belief in God, is separate from and antithetical to science. So you can't believe in evolution and creation is what we're inherently taught in school. But I don't think that that was even intentional. I think it was because people had their own agendas of you have to be taught science in school and we want religion taught. Okay, so we're going to teach both. And then it's taught as you can either believe this or either believe this. But then all of a sudden we think that they're mutually exclusive ideas, and they're not. And religion is also not the same thing as theism intrinsically. It's there are theistic religions, but religion is not the same thing as theism at all.
Do you have an example of a non-theistic religion? Maybe Buddhism?
I mean, I think that atheism is a non-theistic religion, you could call it. I don't really like the word religion because I think that the term religion is basically, I don't know what started it exactly. I don't know the history of the Latin origin and things like that, but it has become a word used by almost more atheists to describe something they don't understand. But if you ask like someone who's Orthodox Jewish, they would not say my religion is Orthodox Judaism. They would say I do this because I believe it's true. It's not religion. And I don't know what Buddhists would say. I think that Buddhism it's kind of emergently theist, but not primarily a theistic religion. It kind of, I think you could deduce that it implies a singular sentient being, but it doesn't state a singular sentient being. It states sentience, though, and that if existence is all that exists, then it implies that it's singular, and therefore sentience is singular. But that's kind of I don't think that, I'm not a Buddhist, but I don't think that Buddhism is wrong either. Its focus is different than the Abrahamic traditions, which is definitely they are theistic religions. People say monotheistic religions. There is no such thing as theism, as polytheism either. This is another misconception, and it's a bad word. Just like atheism is a bad word, polytheism is a bad word. We don't need to even say monotheism. Theism implies monotheism because God is, if God exists, the definition of God is the highest being and not just a more powerful being. And so at least that's what I think we have to use the word God for if it's going to mean anything important. It's not just a more powerful being than us. It is a being that is more powerful than anyone else, and is on it is the highest being. So that is a singular thing. That's not a pluralism or a polytheistic possibility. I mean, if there's multiple beings that are higher than us, that's possible, but there's got to be one that's higher than all of them, or that if existence is sentient, that encompasses all of them as well, and therefore that is what I call God. If you don't want to use the word God, if you want to use the word God for anything that's higher than us, then you have to also have a word for the highest being. And if you believe that existence is sentient, but if you don't, then maybe you can use the word God as anything that's higher than us. But I don't think, why not just use a specific word that, to each one of those beings? You don't have to use the word God. That doesn't really make sense. So I don't think that polytheism is actually a possibility either. Not even just not a logical possibility of reality, but it's not a logical worldview.
In what sense?
Because God is, if God exists, God is the highest being there is. There's not multiple of the highest beings. There's one that would be the highest. And basically, if God is everything, essentially, then that means that God is sentient existence, and there's only one existence. So you can't have multiple existences, because existence intrinsically encompasses all that exists. So you can't have multiple sentient existences. You can only have one. So,
Okay.
yeah. This discussion has been totally corrupted because we don't define God properly, and you have to define God properly and then talk about whether or not he exists, whether or not polytheism is possible, whether or not it's possible as even a worldview, whether or not atheism is possible as a worldview. And if it's not, then, is anti-theism a possible worldview? And I think anti-theism is a possible worldview, but kind of. But
I think
it's not.
Your explanation of atheism and anti-theism, that makes sense to me. And when you define the two words, I don't know any atheists. Maybe I think adult human beings are too conscious. Even the person that has as little wisdom and as little insightful thought as everyone else, I still think that there's a level of consciousness to being an adult human being to where you can't not have an opinion on the things you interact with.
Exactly.
So maybe a baby could be an atheist because it hasn't developed the level of consciousness to actually be able to have an opinion with these things. But an adult human being, I don't, everyone, even I was a self-described atheist at one point, not anymore. And one of the biggest things that changed is my redefinition of God.
Mm-hmm.
God is not, to everybody, to some people, God is Jesus Christ's Father. Mm-hmm. And to a lot of people, he's not. And to the way that you and I are speaking about it, the way that you're speaking about it, a higher power. I mean, there's a lot of scriptures out there that will define God in specific frameworks with specific parameters, and I think it's really difficult again for people to unlearn that and to rip those parameters off of God, to rip those whatever
preconceptions
they've been taught. And so they go into this argument with whatever their vision, whatever this learned vision of God is, and it's hard to even have a discussion at that point.
Yep. And I'm not somebody who doesn't believe in the divinity of many scriptures out there. Actually, I do, and I state that honestly, and recognize that will get me. People who are in the scientific community will hear that and they'll be like, well, we're not going to take this guy seriously now. And that, then I don't want them to. Yeah, I don't care. If they're not capable of being reasonable enough to examine my work on its own, detached from my additional assumptions that are outside to some degree, of the specific proposal that I'm making, then why would I care what they think? I mean, I just don't. I want people to understand my work truthfully. I've seen a lot of people in the theory of everything space, and I'm not going to get into specific people because I just don't want to. But there is a number of people out there who have faced, all of them who have come to similar conclusions that I have, and their work implies similar conclusions, have faced extraordinary amounts of hostility and vitriol. And I understand that is something that most people would want to avoid. And it's caused people to kind of hide the core implications of their theories in hoping that, people will come to it on their own. And that's not what I think is the right way to approach this. I think you need to state clearly the implications of your work and yeah, then let people come to it on their own. But don't try and deceive, or like trick, and I'm not saying it's malicious, but trick people into realizing the truth of something. Just be as honest about it as possible, so that one day maybe they do realize that your perspective is, makes sense to them. Because if you present something in a distorted manner with the hope that it can trick people into, realizing your perspective, then what happens is that they have a distorted viewpoint and understanding of your work, actually, and of what you're trying to say. It's not that they will come to the same conclusions as you because they didn't go through the same path as you. And that, I think, is something that's very important too. Is if there are people who are in this and their work implies that we are inside of a mind, that the universe is a being of some type, then I think that needs to be stated clearly. And I think that it would also help people understand intuitively their work. If you hide the core implications of your work, all of a sudden people who are trying to understand it are not going to be very successful, because they're starting from assumptions that are about what your work eventually implies that are not true.
I find it funny because, it's kind of lying on the basis of the theory of everything. And the theory of everything it's a search for, it's truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's search for objectivity. And so to fabricate it at all is, I don't know, it's very, they're lying to themselves. And then you made a good point, as the people that they're speaking to aren't going to necessarily draw the same conclusion. They're not going to have the same logic leading to that conclusion. And yeah, they might say, oh, we agree with you. And if you want the credit, the credibility, then maybe someone, that's good. They don't actually need to be aligned on the truth on some sort of logic.
Yep.
But it's not going to actually solidify your thought patterns. It's not going to give you another person who you can work with in order to develop these thought patterns, develop this work, and
Mm-hmm.
move forward with it.
Yep. I've seen that very much as the case. I watched when many of these theories have been rolled out. I've seen people try and work with these ideas coming from academic, narratives and institutions, and they have fallen completely on their face. And they were expecting to be able to understand it, and they did not, and they cannot. And that is partially because we're not being explicit in what the implications of a lot of these theories are. Some of them are, pretty explicit, but even I don't think any of them are as explicit as maybe a few of them are. And even though I think more than a few of them actually have the same basic assumption.
Okay.
Theism.
Okay. And pivoting a bit, going back to something you said the theory of everything is the theory that other theories build off of.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you think of the theory of everything, what is it? Qualitative? Is it quantitative? Where is that? How do you think of a theory of everything in those terms?
It's both. People think of the theory of everything as it's a physics theory, or it's a mathematical theory. Max Tegmark has this mathematical universe, and people will have string theory, which is assumed to be a physics theory. And to some degree, it's true that that the fundamental theory is a is a theory of physics and of mathematics, but it's more than that. It's actually essentially a theory that explains mathematics and explains physics and explains biology and explains political science, you could call it, or morality, or sociology. It's a theory that is a framework for the rest of all of these other theories, and also a framework that explains how these other theories and fields interact and build on each other as well, chemistry and biology and physics and sociology. And it's essentially a metaphysics framework that explains mathematics and physics and subsequent fields. It's not just a theory of, it's not a mathematical theory. It's a theory that explains mathematics. This is why Stephen Wolfram calls it correctly meta-mathematics. But what's funny is he calls it meta-mathematics, but that's partially because there's such a stigma now associated with the term metaphysics, which is what we have for hundreds or thousands of years essentially used to describe what is the framework of a fundamental reality is metaphysics. But because that's associated with religion, now we're calling it meta-mathematics, but it's the same thing. And
so what's the difference between physics and metaphysics?
That is a difficult question to answer, actually, and I think that you'd have to figure out what that real difference is, because I don't think that it's laid out. Metaphysics is described as officially as the branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things. And physics is complicated because you have two branches of it essentially right now. You have kind of general relativity, which also kind of leads into and Newtonian physics and thermodynamics and all these other things that are possible within a spectrum, I guess you could say. So speed and temperature and force and all kinds of things like that, mass. But then you have quantum physics, which is really, I think, metaphysics. I think it's more actually metaphysics than it is physics, if you were going to divide the two. And I think that that's part of the reason why we don't have metaphysics, is because quantum physics is kind of metaphysics. It's like the branch between physics and metaphysics. It's like looking at the metaphysics from a physics perspective, but you can't actually understand the standard model and particle interactions without having a metaphysics framework that explains what is actually happening there. And what is a quark? What is a neutrino? What is a proton even? And that is something that you need a metaphysics framework to do, really. And we don't have that, because the only way to do that really is through the perspective of I believe, a theistic approach, or the assumption that sentience is the fundamental nature of existence. And without that, though, you can't really get a metaphysics framework for elementary particles. We're starting to get that in some proposals that are in philosophy, like idealism, which I think is actually good, and I think that it's correct. So you have, like, Bernardo Kastrup has his framework for idealism, and that's not a new concept. None of this is new, but we're rediscovering the wisdom of the past is really what's kind of happening. And it's funny, when Garrett Lisi released his E8, his theory based on E8, the mathematical structure of E8, everybody was so drawn to it, and nobody knew why, other than it was just beautiful. Like, you look at E8 as a structure, and it's described by mathematicians as, the most beautiful mathematical structure. I don't know how true that is, but it might be true. And then when you read his paper, which is called An Exceptionally Simple Theory of Everything, his original paper on this, I love that paper, actually. And it shows different perspectives on symmetry structures involving, particle physics. And you can see the Buddhist flower of life, and you can see the Star of David in these structures, and in the geometry of these particle symmetries. And you can see this on his website, I think, which is the Elementary Particle Explorer website. And he has an incredible model on there that you can manipulate, and you can, look at E6 and E8, and you can move it in 4 dimensions and spin it in 3 dimensions, and you can see all the symmetry structures of of E8, essentially. And you can see all of these religious symbols in this in this stuff. But it's like it's ignored. It's like it's talked about completely, but it's thought about as just being coincidence that's random, which is just crazy. That doesn't exist.
That is crazy. And it is crazy to think that this is all just coincidence that exists, and it just happened, and we're here. And I mean, the thing we spoke about this last time was, you can't get 1 from 0.
Yep.
And that, to me, makes a lot of sense. The conservation of mass and energy within this universe. No mass has been created or destroyed, and no energy has been created or destroyed. So that means it was placed in here from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it's really simple. You can't get 1 from 0. And you said that
you can get 1 if you divide 0 by itself, but you can get 1.
What do you mean?
Like, I'm not saying that your calculator will tell you that this is correct, because it won't. But if you think about 0, if you divide anything by itself, then you get 1. That's what I'll say. But 0 is it's interesting, because sentience is implied to be, in my work, a logical inevitability of existence. So us being here, I believe that multiplicity of sentience must have been a choice, because oneness is the nature of existence itself. So you'd have to make a choice to go against that. But any system that is enclosed, like existence, because existence encompasses all that exists, and therefore it is intrinsically enclosed in some way. Any information system that is enclosed, you can think of as like a circle of a string that's like a circle, like a ring or something like that, like a 0 looking shape. And information is flowing and, going around the circle. And that's basically, it's referencing itself, because there's nothing else to reference. So, and information that references the self is self-awareness, essentially. And so I don't think God has any choice in whether or not he exists. And he had a choice in whether or not we exist, but not whether or not he exists. And I don't think God could not exist. It's just inevitable. But and I don't think he could stop himself from existing if he tried. Like, I don't know if we can even stop ourselves from existing, if you're thinking about what happens to us after we, pass from here. But but God could not die if he wanted to, is what I'm trying to say. Essentially, I don't believe that, but it's funny that it looks like a zero, and but it's also kind of an infinite singular system. It's a single system, but it goes around infinitely. That's when you get married, you put a ring on your finger, and the symbolism of it a lot is like, this is an enclosed loop that goes on forever, and it's one and infinite at the same time, almost. But I always thought that symbolism was interesting. But yeah, zero as a concept, as far as it means nothing, which doesn't really ever exist, really. I mean, nothingness meaning absence doesn't exist. That concept is kind of like infinity as well. Like, there is no real zero fundamentally. There's no empty set fundamentally, and there is also not fundamentally infinite. Infinity is infinite growth, but at any given moment, that growth is finite, but it just continues infinitely. People think Donald Hoffman talks about, like, I forgot what exact mathematical concept he was discussing, but he talked about how if you add infinity to infinity, then you get a higher infinity, and therefore that doesn't make sense, because he basically was talking about a countable infinity. You can't have a countable infinity. It's a concept. But just like zero is also zero as an empty set is just a concept. That is not fundamentally possible. It is possible if you're like in relativity and you're like, how many apples do you have in your fridge right now? I have 0 apples. Okay. But if you're like thinking about zero existence, meaning absence of existence, that's not possible. So.
No. And even thinking about it deeply, like, it just seems improbable too, after death, that there's nothing, that existence just ends.
Yeah, I don't think that it's, I think logically, the default is that you continue to exist, but because if you think about existence or the universe as, it's like a sentient computer, space-time and the interaction space, you could call it the change space, I call it, is where we live, right now, you and I are. And that's basically the desktop of this computer. And you're like a file that's a sentient file that's being written. You're writing and God's writing at the same time. And you're co-creating your story. And when you die, this is essentially the closing of the document. And you can either delete the document because it's become too corrupted, maybe, which happens on your computer, or you can save the document because it's worth saving. And the thing is, though, is that information is only information in context. But I don't even like to say that, because what's more true to say is that information is context. It's not, there isn't information outside of context and information inside of context. There's only information is context. Information outside of context is not information. And so the context of all the information that you have gathered and created, essentially, that you've generated by living, is only, it only exists in the context of you. So if you were to save the information that has been generated by your life, then you also have to save the sentience that contextualizes the information that has been generated by your life, and that is you. So unless your file has become corrupted, which I do think is possible, then I think that the default assumption is that we are saved, literally, super literally saved, when our files are closed, which is when we die. Then, But it's not that means that when after you die, it implies that you are still self-aware, but you just don't have the ability to change anymore. So you exist outside of the arrow of time that's generated by your mind, changing things, but you are still aware of yourself. I think you're aware of the sentience of the universe, aka God. You're probably aware of others that exist as well, some of whom are, in the afterlife like you, and also some that are not, and that are, still in the change space. But you can't make changes anymore, but you're aware. And that sounds very similar to a lot of religious implications, but even the words in that metaphor are the same. Being saved is very commonly used in Christian communities, but I think that it's a super literally true concept. It has to be the case. Otherwise, what's the point of being here? If that information, if you're just going to delete the information after the end of this journey, then what's the point of even creating the journey? That doesn't make sense. So you have to, this is one of the things that physicists are missing, and so are biologists and sociologists. Everyone in the academic community right now, pretty much, outside of specific departments and specific individuals, is missing the fact that intentionality is part of the system. And
what do you mean by that?
It means that we're here intentionally, and my work suggests that is it has to be the case, because if oneness is the intrinsic nature of existence and self-awareness is the intrinsic nature of existence, then it would require an intentional action that is against the nature of the system in order to create multiplicity of sentience, which we know exists because we are here. And therefore, that this entire creation that we are in, the universe, you could call it, or creation, is here intentionally. That doesn't mean existence is here intentionally. Existence has intentions, but the universe and all that exists within it that is, apparently finite, that is here intentional. It was intentionally created. And so that, if you know that, then you can start to deduce why it was intentionally created. And that would tell you quite a bit about, or it should be able to tell you quite a bit about where we are going next. Where is evolution heading? I don't disagree with the term evolution. I work with, wildlife with some of the top biologists in the world, and I can't deny natural selection. I just don't think that it's totally separate from intentionality. It can't be. Eric Weinstein talks about this too. He talks about how evolution by natural selection as a random process does not mathematically essentially make sense, and that there are some biologists that are showing that this is the case, and they are largely ignored because people have bigotries against, the idea that that this isn't a random process, and that this has a degree of intentionality behind it, which means that theism is implied, and that is something that they don't want to be the case. But evolution and creationism are not mutually exclusive ideas. They're both true, I believe, at least according to my work. But people have so much assumptions attached to these terms that we need to get past. Evolution does not mean random and meaningless, and creation does not mean 7 24-hour period, days, like necessarily exactly the way that we think about a day. That doesn't make sense at all either, because there is no sun to dictate what is a day, and all kinds of things. And if even the original Hebrew of Scripture, of the Torah, when you're looking at Genesis, and it says God created the world in 7 yom, which means period. It doesn't mean day necessarily. It's used to also mean day, but it doesn't just mean day. It means 7 periods.
And what's the big difference in that description?
It means that that these ideas are not necessarily opposed to each other, and that it's our preconceptions are false preconceptions about what these things are, what these terms imply, that are due to our own personal lives, and that are very, that have their blind biases. Yeah, they're biases that are forming what we think these things mean, and we need to figure out a way to get past decades of malware that has been put inside of our minds. And I will say that that term came to me naturally while stating it, but actually the first person that I've ever heard say that, I wasn't thinking about it when I said it just now, but just to give him credit, was Eric Weinstein. Once I heard him in a Discord state that he thought most people had malware in their minds and that it was distorting their ability to do everything. And I agree with him completely on that.
I agree with that as well. I mean, and it's tough because we don't have a choice when we're 6 years old, 7 years old, all the way until, like, you said you considered yourself an atheist up until 24 years old.
Mm-hmm.
That's 24 years of learning that you took in. And then there, even through the consciousness of I'm biased, there are certain perspectives I have which falsify reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough to let those go. It's, I would debate nearly impossible, and it's more work, and you gotta always, it probably does come down to a sense of theism, of doing something that will be able to enable you to disregard malware,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to,
or recognize it.
yes, recognize it and not be so biased towards it. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain protocol most likely that will assist in us doing that, which will allow us to take on actions that we feel, when we look back on them, we're actually proud of, not, act a way that we look back on and we say, that was not what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then that can begin, because, we talk about the theory of everything, but then there's a point, there are theories that are built on this. There's work that's built on this. And so a lot of times, for the layman, I think they need to understand that this is a framework that you build on, and you still need that initial framework, because you can't, you even brought it back to the aspect of elementary particles. What are they?
Yeah.
Like a scientist, a physicist, he can get all the way down to the protons, but what are they?
Yeah. I mean, string theory implies that they are, it's not just string theory, but even Garrett Lisi said this, and this is correct, essentially, is that they're excitations on strings of information. And, but in what? What strings of information in what? Think about what that logically implies, and most obviously, and what is a, information in itself. It informs. Well, informs what is probably the wrong question. Actually, the right question is who does it inform? You can't inform something, you inform someone. And so maybe strings of information in a mind, and but it's like you can't get anywhere beyond this is, the universe is made of strings, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not, there's a level below that you need to get to that explains strings. So you can't actually say string theory is a fundamental theory, because strings of what? Okay, information maybe, but like, what in what, for, from what? And the answer to those questions is actually different questions, which is from who, and in who, to who, like. But science doesn't ask why or who very much. They ask, there's 6 fundamental questions, I guess you could say, and who, what, where, when, why, and how. And we ask 4 of those in science, but we don't ask 2 of them, which is why and who. And you need the why and the who. You need the who to get the why, and you need the why to get the how. And this is a progression of building in and of itself, as well. So from the how, then you get where and when, and but we start from where and when, and we go to the how, and then we stop, and we don't take that next leap to why and who. But it's kind of hard, because you have to jump to who before you get to why. Actually, you can't actually assume that there's a why without assuming that there's a who. So this causes all kinds of issues that basically create a hard wall that you cannot get past if you do not imply theism in physics and metaphysics and philosophy, mathematics even. Mathematics is not fundamental, and it's assumed to be, so is physics, but they're not. There's a reason why mathematics is the way that it is, and there's a metaphysical framework or mathematical framework that explains why mathematics is the mathematics that we see. And there's a mathematical framework that explains that, and there's a metaphysical framework that explains why the physics that we see is what we see. And sentient singularity theory is a framework that seems to do that. That wasn't something I really deeply thought that I could do, but it turns out it's simpler than what people would imagine that it is. Fundamental theories are assumed to be super complicated. Once I was in a Discord and I was talking about how I thought that I understood, the basic philosophical implications and metaphysical implications of geometric unity. And I know that I do, because I've talked to Eric before, and I know that I do. And I was the only one without, PhD in math or physics, or who wasn't working on a PhD in math or physics in this Discord discussion that I was in. And I was the only one that understood the basic message of what geometric unity was essentially stating, and or implying.
What is the basic message?
I believe, and this, I know that this is true, is that we're inside a mind.
Wow.
And Eric Weinstein has implied that before, but he hasn't stated it explicitly outside of semi-private discussions. But there's lots of things. He's talked about the fact that we are the AI inside of some other system, basically. So he combines the cosmology that's attached to geometric unity is basically a combination of the simulation hypothesis and the singularity idea. And that is also the same exact implications of sentient singularity theory and other works out there. So it's not unique, but it's funny because once he showed like a Hopf vibration, which is it's a mathematical shape that's like a bunch of strings that are twisting in and on itself. You can look it up, and it's a beautiful, fascinating shape. And he showed it on Joe Rogan, and he said this is the most important mathematical object in the universe. And then when Joe Rogan asked what it was, he was like, it's a 4-dimensional shape projected into 3 dimensions. I don't remember exactly how he described it, but something like that. And it didn't really make sense to anybody, you know. But what I thought was interesting is just like E8, which comes from Garrett Lisi's theory, is the focus of Garrett Lisi's theory, but is Eric Weinstein and Garrett Lisi kind of describe each other as like their arch nemesis. They're competing in a friendly way. And when people looked at E8 and they looked at this Hopf vibration, they were fascinated, but nobody knows why, because nobody knows exactly what these are. They're just beautiful structures. And it's like, maybe on some subconscious level, we know that we're looking in the mirror when we see these things. And I think that that's the case. I think that our subconscious is recognizing itself to some degree. And that's why everybody's like, what is this incredible shape? But, you know, when Joe Rogan, and I don't know if Eric Weinstein would say this, but I would say that this is the implication of my work. So I would assume that it might be also the implication of geometric unity. But if Joe Rogan asked me, what is a Hopf vibration, I would say it is a mental structure of information that is referencing itself and processing. And that makes sense. You know, people can understand that. And all of a sudden it kind of makes sense why you're so drawn to this thing, because that's what you are. You're looking at yourself in a super literal sense, not even just like an emergent sense where we see our limbs and things like that, that's a projection from, and Donald Hoffman's work states this, and he's correct. That is a projection of, you know, the degrees of freedom and constraints of mental processes itself. But it's not fundamental. It's more fundamental to think about yourself as a fiber bundle, and which is a mind. Some fiber bundles, at least, would be minds. But the people, when I said this in this group, I was like, I think that geometric unity is implying that we're inside a mind. And all of a sudden, a couple people in the group were like, that makes a lot of sense, actually. You know, that maybe that's why he calls it like an observerse or something like that. And all of a sudden, things started to click for a few people. But then I faced extraordinary hostility from others who were like, how could you ever think that you know, having no training formally in any of this stuff, could understand this super complex theory? And this person's just assuming that this is super complex. But the reality is that if you're talking about fundamental reality, you know, you're talking about the simplest structures that exist, not the most complicated structures. And if you're talking about like the math or the quantities that are involved and the quantitative relationships and symmetries involved with creation even itself, that math is the simplest math that you could possibly do. It's not the most complicated. It's the simplest. Multiplicity, it doesn't even exist. So, you know, there isn't even high numbers involved. It's like 1. Okay, start there. You know, how complicated is that number? And but these things are assumed to be very complicated, and that's what makes it so complicated to us. But it doesn't really make it so complicated. It makes it impossible. If you assume that this is complicated, it is going to be impossible. If you have to assume that this is not only simple, it's super simple. It's simple in a way that nothing else that we know of is simple. And that hangs people up quite a bit. And it also threatens people's egos who have devoted, you know, decades to and thousands of dollars into, you know, being educated in this field. But there is no one who has credentials that qualify them to speak on and be experts in a theory of everything. There is no one that is out there that has that kind of credentials. If there were experts on theories of everything that were academically accepted, those people would have created and demonstrated that they had created an accurate or, you know, true fundamental framework for reality. And that has not happened. And so to think that just because you have a degree in physics or mathematics qualifies you to speak on a, theories of fundamental reality. That is not true. That doesn't make any sense logically, and it also doesn't. It makes sense apparently when you look at what people who do have those degrees have done. They have not accomplished what they're trying to do yet, and until they do, and they can demonstrate it in an applicable way, not that's profound, not just we found the Calabi-Yau manifold 6-dimensional structure and it's implied in math. And I do think that that's a true discovery, but it's not understood right now, and therefore can't be applied. And until you do that, you don't demonstrate competence in having a fundamental theory that you have that is an actual framework that is linked to reality. It's just math equations outside of context. So that's something that we don't realize yet, but we need to, in order to reform this is another one of those things that the conversation needs to be reframed. There's no one who has credentials that qualify them as an expert on a theory of everything. The only people that understand this truly are people who are working on it from first principles, who are largely outside of academia.
That makes sense. And you spoke about it, how in the how-to video you posted, that traditionally physics has been the framework that people attempt to define the theory of everything by. Mm-hmm. And your argument was that physics is defined by the theory of everything.
Exactly.
Physics does not define the theory of everything.
Yeah. A fundamental theory is defining and contextualizing of physics. Physics is not defining and contextualizing of a fundamental theory. It is, you should get the structures and properties that we observe in physics emergently, naturally, from a true fundamental framework. It should naturally imply the properties and symmetries of the standard model that we see, and the the properties of physics and chemistry and biology and sociology and all morality, even all of these things that we see in our world. But it should emerge naturally to some degree. It's not. You can use those fields and the theories within those fields to test the predictive power of your metaphysical framework, your fundamental framework, and you must do that actually to be rigorous. But you cannot start from those. You have to start from what is most fundamental. What are your most fundamental assumptions about reality, which I described earlier in this discussion as, existence is singular by definition, and that sentience is the most primary nature of existence it is the nature of existence that you must most primarily assume, because it is the lens through which you observe and interact with every other perspective and assumption and that you encounter. And so you start from that. You have to start from that. If you don't, you cannot do this. And I know people will say things like, well, maybe there's just different ways to do it. No, there isn't.
There's probably not multiple ways to do it.
No.
Almost certainly not.
No. That doesn't mean that there's no freedoms in how you approach things and language that you use and things like that, but and that there isn't different paths to getting to this journey, but that those two things are true for everyone and inescapable for everyone that would attempt this ever. And that's why they have to be the starting point. There's no way to do anything without that. In fact, you can't actually make sense of any field without that, not even just a fundamental theory, you can't make sense of chemistry really without that. You can memorize chemistry, but you can't have a metaphysical framework that explains why the things are happening the way that they are. You can't understand elements and atoms and neutrons and protons and even politics and morality in a logically coherent manner for in an extended way without starting from those two primary assumptions, because they are intrinsic. To deny them is to deny logic. You have to prioritize firsthand information above secondhand information always. Tom Campbell and Donald Hoffman recently had a discussion on a channel. I forgot what the exact name of it is, but I did a stream on it recently, and they stated basically the same thing, that just because you read it in a book does not mean that you understand it. What you understand is what you experience firsthand. And this was also stated by Brett Weinstein, Eric Weinstein's brother, on a recent podcast as well, where he basically said that the right way to fix education is to give people tasks that they have to do that undeniably show them whether or not they accomplish the task or not. It's not just memorization of things that who knows where it came from, but it's, fix this engine. Well, did you figure it out, or do you understand how the engine works or not? Well, if you can't fix it, then you do not understand how it works. But if you were able to identify the problem and figure it out and fix it, then the odds are that you do understand how it works. So we don't have that in education anymore. We're prioritizing secondhand information above firsthand information. We're prioritizing memorization above experience. And it has broken everybody's even concept of what it means to think.
I agree with what you just said. And it's really interesting. We have mathematical people, physicists, mathematicians tackling this problem, the theory of everything. And these people, generally, I'm an engineer by trade. I went to school with a lot of mathematicians, went to school with a lot of physicists.
Mm-hmm.
They traditionally, I have found, some of them are very deep thinkers, but a lot of them are studiers, and they're very good studiers, and they're very good students, and they love school, and they love being taught things. And that's all important. Studying is important.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding and reading things that other people learned and did, that's valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But you brought it back, and I think it even relates and in your how-to guide, you spoke to the value of simply the title, the name of the theory.
Yep.
String theory. I don't really understand what string theory, if you just tell me string theory, I don't necessarily understand what that is. Sentient singularity, singular and sentience.
Mm-hmm.
One consciousness.
Yep.
And it goes back to people, what is it? Is it simple? Theory of everything. When you hear that, a lot of people are going to say, this has got to be a complicated, theory. This has got to be a complicated sort of thinking because it's everything.
Yep.
Well, maybe, but, sentient singularity, what's your firsthand information? What do you feel? What did you do? What are you thinking? What are you seeing?
Yeah. The theory of everything. A fundamental theory is, if insofar as it being a theory of everything, is not a theory that explains everything by looking at by explaining the thing itself. It's a theory that explains the observer of things. It is the framework of someone, not something. but the framework of someone is where things are interpreted. So everything that exists in the context of a mental structure, of information processing, of a being. And a fundamental theory explains that being, not water bottles. But why do we see water bottle is different than a theory of just focused on that starts from the water bottle. It's starting from the observer of the water bottle to get water bottle, not from water bottle, which doesn't go anywhere. Like, that's why you can't get a theory of everything, because there's infinite things, really. But you can get a theory of every one, and that implies that it is a theory of everything because it's emergently a theory of everything. It's fundamentally or primarily a theory of every one, but it is emergently a theory of everything. You can't have it primarily a theory of everything because there are infinite things. There's conceptual things, and there's actions, and there's water bottles, and wood, and desks, and microphones, whatever. Like, it just goes on forever. So you can't have a theory that does that, but you can have a theory that describes the specific structure that observes all that. And that's why I say sentient singularity theory is primarily a theory of everyone. That's the problem.
The way you just described it clicked for me really well. The theory of everyone, taking the contextual firsthand information we see, applying it to God, applying it to what he is observing, his firsthand contextual experiences. That makes a lot of sense to me.
If you start from that framework, you can start to understand what space-time is. You can start to understand what elementary particles are, probably, and it becomes intuitive. That doesn't mean it doesn't take rigorous, examination, because it does. Some of these things do. Some of these things will just click, and automatically you're like, oh, that makes sense that that's like that. But if you're going to try and understand something specific, if it's multiple steps, from the initial assumption to get to, then it's going to take some rigorous, examination. But it's still going to be intuitive if you start from and maintain the primary assumptions that are true. But you have to start from them, and you have to maintain them. And that those primary assumptions are that existence is singular, and that existence is sentient. And that's why, like I said, you have to have a theory that the name gives you the information necessary to start interpreting the theory. And it's so important that it's necessary. It's not just let's see who has the coolest name. It's that I didn't want to have my own theory, and I saw how many theories there were out there of fundamental reality. I saw geometric unity. I saw Clee Irwin's emergence theory. I saw Garrett Lacey's EA theory. I saw Chris Langan's CTMU. I saw Donald Hoffman's conscious agent theory, which is actually a pretty good name. I saw David Deutsch's constructor theory, which almost is a good name, but not in the context in which a constructor is defined. And then, there's others. There's the autodidactic universe, and there's assembly theory, and with Lee Cronin, and string theory, and loop quantum gravity. There's all these quote unquote fundamental theories out there. And, even though Clee Irwin's emergence theory has a lot of overlap with my work, emergence from what, and what is being geometrically united in geometric unity? What are the strings that are vibrating in 11-dimensional hyperspace or whatever in string theory? What is that loop of, quantum gravity. Like, what is that really? Not just as an abstract concept that we're just taking as a miracle. What is E8? And none of these theories explicitly state that, other than basically conscious agent theory, but with Donald Hoffman. Constructor theory doesn't work as a fundamental theory, but it's very close. And the reason why is because a constructor and constructor theory, which is David Deutsch and Chiara Marletto, that are the primary, researchers attached to that theory. That's a very good approach, but the problem is that a constructor is not a sentient being in that, and it's also not like, you could still say that even if it was that a constructor was a sentient being, which it doesn't make sense to call something a constructor that's not sentience doesn't make sense, but whatever. Even if you did assume that it was sentient, sentience is still the primary nature, not that it is constructing. That it has a choice, whether or not to do that, but it is sentient is the primary nature. And conscious is too vague a term now, I think, whereas, Donald Hoffman's conscious agent theory, which I agree with what, he's trying to do. I think that what he's doing is correct, basically describing that space-time is an emergent projection from the constraints and degrees of freedom of mind, essentially. And that's correct. That's implied by my work. But we will say there's I'm conscious of something, and then there's a consciousness. And so and what is consciousness? Is it the ability to think? What is it really? And it's just not very well defined anymore, at least, but it might never have been. But sentience is very specifically defined. It is emphasizing feelings. Anything, a sentient or a sentient being or sentient singularity feels. That's what it does. And from there, you get thoughts and everything else coming later. So it's what is defining of the term sentience is the primary nature of reality, which is why I chose it. And singularity is not just oneness, but it's oneness creating ones within it. So it's like infinite oneness. Like a singularity, is thought of as infinite oneness, whether it's the singularity of AI or whether or not it is a singularity of a black hole. But it's Sentient Singularity Theory describes fundamental reality on my website, which is sentientsingularity.com, as a singular sentience creating additional sentient singularities within itself, or sentient beings within itself. It's a single sentient being creating more sentient beings infinitely, according to a specific pattern that my work lays out, that is going to be, described. It has been described in my work, but I will lay it out more, or in a more organized fashion fairly soon. But that is why I decided to create this theory specifically, instead of just joining someone else's work, which was my original intention, was because I have an experiment that I want done. And that is the eventual goal of this. It's part of the eventual goal of this work. And but I have to lay out the framework for why I want this experiment done, why it makes sense. And I was just going to go to like the Quantum Gravity Research Foundation, which is Clee Irwin's emergence theory, community, or I was going to go somewhere else, maybe approach Eric or something and try and get this experiment done if it made sense with their theories, which I assumed that it did. But then I realized that nobody was picking one of these theories above another. Like, we just had an ever-growing amount, and especially lately, there's been an explosion of proposed theories of everything from everyone, and they're not new. You could argue that theological traditions like Buddhism and Judaism and Islam are theories of everything, but and I think that makes sense. But it's I realized that part of the reason why nobody's picking any of these very similar theories above any of the others is because they are very similar, but they're also, none of them have a name that implies the fundamental nature and structure of existence in a very explicit and obvious manner that gives you a perspective that allows you to move forward in understanding the rest of the details. Geometric unity, emergence theory, convergence theory, like string theory, none of this really helps you gives you a starting point. And then I realized, like, we have to have one that does, and that's why I recreated this. So I'm not going to say ego isn't, I'm egoless, and that's not true at all, but I did not originally have, at least, as much of an attachment to this because I'm from outside the field. I never wanted to make a physics theory or metaphysics theory, and I wasn't religious, so I didn't have an agenda. And but then I did realize, like, it is necessary for me to not just join up with others, which I do want to do. I think we do need to unite. If we have similar assumptions about reality, academia is not accepting these people or these theories, then we have to form a coalition and an institution ourselves. But I do think that it's necessary that until a better term is presented for the theory a fundamental theory, that sentient singularity theory is the most complete term for a true fundamental theory. That doesn't mean there isn't a better one out there. And if somebody comes up with one, I will admit, like, that we should use theirs. That doesn't disregard my work, at all. It still matters, and just like everybody else's work still matters. And even the names of their theories still can be used to describe their work. But you do need a singular framework for the contextualization of everything else, and that framework is obviously sentience, because that's what we all are. So I don't see a way around sentient singularity theory being the correct term, but I do recognize that it's possible that I'm wrong, but I just don't see it yet. And I invite anybody to challenge me on that. That's fine. I just want truth. Like I said, my work is not disregarded because we use a different term, but and just like the work of geometric unity is not wrong or should not be disregarded for using if it falls within the framework of sentient singularity theory. But that doesn't mean we even get rid of the name geometric unity or the name string theory. I don't think we should. I think we should keep them, but everything is going to fall within a framework, a theistic framework. And maybe we just call it theism, but even that's not, like, what is theism? It's the belief in a singular sentience. So, like, you can't really escape that even then, I think. But we will see how this goes. Like I said, my eventual goal is an experiment, and I don't know. I'm not trying to become the next Einstein or anything like that. I don't think that is a worthy goal. It's like people who, you should get into music if you love music and you're talented at it, and people resonate with what you're, creating, not because you want to be famous. I live in Hollywood area, and I can tell you that the people that just want to be famous are not the ones that make it. And it's the people who have grit and also novelty and talent to some degree, and that will continue to do, to act and to sing and whatever it is, play music, whatever it is that they want to do. That doesn't mean that they're going to be played on the radio, but that shouldn't be your goal. Like, the goal is to do what is true in any field, especially, not even including this one, especially this one, That's the primary goal of it. But like I said before, ego is very attached to it, and I no longer care about the institutions. I do sometimes debate whether or not I should go back to school and get my PhD in philosophy, because apparently if you have a degree in philosophy or biology or physics or math, you can talk about anything that you want and people will listen. But I would feel like such a hypocrite because I don't really believe anymore that has the value to my goal that I and it's also what, I don't need, if what you say is true, then you don't need a degree in order for that truth to be true. That truth is true, and it might take people a while to come around to it, and maybe it would take people less time if you did have a degree. But the thing is that those people who would initially come to you because you have a degree and not otherwise, I don't care about their opinion anyways, because they're judging the work based on a degree, not something else. And I have gotten farther in this discussion already than I ever could have imagined, even though I'm not going to say I expected to fail, but I certainly didn't know how I would succeed. And I'm not saying I have succeeded or failed or anything, but when I went into this, I mean, I'm a pretty self-aware person for the most part. Not, we all have our blind spots, but I recognized that I was a guy who had no background in the associated or assumed to be associated fields that I was about to be engaging in. And I knew how that was going to go, but it's, I've persisted because I believe in what I'm doing. It's not, I think I have an obligation to do this. You have an obligation to say the truth, and especially if you're the only one who's saying it. And I'm not saying I'm the only one who's saying it, but I think that there's specifics about the way that I'm saying it that I'm the only one that is saying that are important.
My guest today has been Tyler Goldstein. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Tyler.
Thank you. This was great.